I'd like to focus on one mistake of growing importance these days. It's the tendency in politics and in everyday life to confuse market reasoning with moral reasoning. It's a striking feature of contemporary life that money and markets loom larger and larger. The last 3 decades have been a time of rising market faith. The faith that markets and market mechanisms and market thinking can lead us to the public good. Over the last 3 decades, we've experienced a quiet revolution, almost without realizing it. We in democratic societies have drifted from having market economies to becoming market societies. The difference is this: a market economy is a tool, a valuable and effective tool for organizing productive activity. And market economies have brought prosperity and affluence to countries around the world. But a market society is different. A market society is a place where almost everything is up for sale. It's a way of life in which market values invade almost every aspect of life. Let me give you a couple of examples. If you ever are convicted to a jail sentence in Santa Barbara, California, just in case that happens to anyone here, you should know that if you don't like the standard accommodations in the jail, you can buy a prison cell upgrade. For how much, do you suppose? You didn't know that? It's a good idea. Well, first you should know how much it costs. Well, $82 a night.
I can think of some Israelis who would want to be transferred for their sentence there at $80. You know, Israelis are fighting to come back to jails in Israel.
All right, we'll come. All right, we'll get to that. Take a more consequential example. The outsourcing of war to private military companies. In Iraq and Afghanistan, there were more paid military contractors on the ground than there were U.S. military troops. Now, we never had a public debate about whether we wanted to outsource war to private companies, but that is what has happened. Take a different kind of example: the growing use of cash incentives to solve social problems. In many major U.S. cities, they're trying to lift up the academic achievement of kids from poor backgrounds by offering cash incentives to get good grades or to score high on tests. They've tried this in New York, in Washington, in Chicago. In Dallas, they offer third graders, young kids, $2 for each book they read. Now, the goal is admirable: to get these kids to read. But some might hesitate if you were in charge of the schools. I imagine some of you might hesitate to adopt this solution, the $2 per book. Why? Well, from the standpoint of mainstream economics, it's an easy decision. Some kids may love to read, but others may not. 2 incentives work better than 1. But this assumption may be based on a mistake underlying the hesitation some of us may have for paying kids to read or get good grades. What is it? Well, it might be that the monetary payment doesn't just add an incentive. It may crowd out attitudes and norms, may corrupt a certain attitude toward reading and learning that we want to cultivate, namely, reading for its own sake. Now, these experiments have had mixed results. In New York, the money didn't lead to any improvement in test scores or grades. In Dallas, the $2 did lead the kids to read more books. It also led them to read shorter books. But the real question is, what will become of these kids when they grow up and when the money stops? Will they have learned to love reading, so they'll carry on doing it even when no one's paying them $2? Or will they have learned the lesson that reading is something that you do for pay, in which case, when the money stops, so will the reading? A friend of mine pays his young children $1 for each thank you note they write. I've received some of these thank you notes. And I can tell by reading them that they were written under a certain duress. My wife and I look askance at this practice. We wonder how these kids will turn out. There are two scenarios. It could be that by being paid to write thank you notes, they'll get in the habit of doing it and continue doing it even when they're no longer paid, in which case the habit will lead to the higher motivation of gratitude, and all will be well. But there's another scenario. It may be that the lesson that they're learning is that thank you notes are a chore, a form of piecework that you should do for pay. And if that's the lesson they learn when the money stops, so will the thank you notes. Their moral education may be corrupted, and they may find it difficult ever to learn the virtue of gratitude. In Switzerland, they were trying to decide where to locate a nuclear waste site. No community wants one in its backyard. They identified a small town in the mountains of Switzerland as the safest place. Before the parliament voted, though, they had to get the approval of the town. And they did a survey asking the residents, if the parliament votes to put it here, would you accept it? 51% said yes. Then they asked a second question. They sweetened the deal. They said, suppose the parliament votes to put it here and offers to pay each resident of the town a yearly amount of money in compensation. Then would you accept? So now how many do you think accepted? What do you think the percentage was then? 80? 90? It dropped in half. Well, it's interesting why. It dropped from 51% to 25% once the money was offered. What was going on? Well, it might be they thought, oh, if they're offering us money, it must really be dangerous. We don't want that. But it turns out that wasn't the reason, because the estimate of the risk turns out to have been the same before they were offered the money and after. So what was going on? Well, they asked the people, they said, we didn't want to be bribed. It felt like a bribe. And yet it was a cash incentive. Economic rationality says incentives work. People respond to incentives. So what happened? In the first case, they were willing to accept the waste dump here, even though it involved risk, out of a sense of patriotism, a sense of the common good, civic virtue. The country needed the energy, and the waste had to go somewhere. But when people were offering them money, it became a financial transaction. It changed the character of the act. Now they were being asked to sell out, so to speak, the safety of themselves and their families, and they weren't willing to be bribed. What these examples illustrate is a mistake that lies at the heart of standard economic reasoning. And the mistake is this, that economic exchange, market exchange, does not touch or taint or change the character of the goods. Now, this may be true when we're talking about material goods. cars or toasters or flat-screen televisions. If you sell me a flat-screen television or give it to me as a gift, the good will be the same. It'll work just the same either way. But the same may not be true when market reasoning and market exchange are extended to non-material goods, such as teaching and learning, health, civic life, national security, thank you notes. Once economics goes abroad into non-material domains, as it increasingly does, we have to recognize the possibility that markets are not inert, but they may change and sometimes corrupt and degrade the character of the goods being exchanged. So this is the mistake at the heart of economic reasoning that I think we need to try to remedy. Actually, I propose two remedies to the mistake that I've described. One has to do with economics. We need to reinvent economics. We need to recognize that there is no value-neutral science of choice or of rational decision-making, no value-neutral science of how to avoid mistakes in general. We need to reconnect, if this is right, we need to reconnect economics with its origins in moral and political philosophy. We need to recognize that economics and ethics are not two separate subjects. They're inescapably connected. And that leads to a second remedy. And that has to do with the role of money and markets in our public life. If economic reasoning and market values crowd out sometimes important non-market values worth caring about, then to decide where markets belong, it's not enough to think about economic efficiency and economic rationality alone. We need a public debate, a morally robust public debate about where markets serve the public good and where they don't belong, where they might actually corrupt or degrade or crowd out attitudes and norms and values worth caring about. Now, this is not an easy thing to do because it requires that we learn to deliberate together in public about hard moral questions, including questions about the meaning of goods, ranging from family life to health, to education, to the environment, to national security, to the meaning of citizenship. We disagree in democratic societies about the meaning of goods. And so we're tempted to avoid those morally fraught debates. And that makes market reasoning and economic science as a value-neutral science tempting, as a refuge, as an alternative to what we see as the hopelessly contested, fraught moral arguments that we would otherwise have to face. But my suggestion is that this tendency to shrink from a morally engaged public debate about the meaning of goods and about where markets belong, I think the tendency to shrink from it is a mistake. Because in the end, the question of markets is not mainly an economic question. It's really a question of how we want to live together. Do we want a society where everything is up for sale? Or are there certain moral and civic goods that markets do not honor and money cannot buy? Thank you very much.